Hey everyone, this is an article by Loren Goldner titled Amadeo Bordiga, The Agrarian Question and the International Revolutionary Movement. For many decades, revolutionary Marxists, this is by Loren Goldner. For many decades, revolutionary Marxists have understood the social realities of the Soviet Union, China, and other so-called, quote, socialist societies to be the negation of Marx's project of working class and human emancipation. Many theoreticians, beginning with Rosa Luxemburg in her 1918 The Russian Revolution, followed by Matic, Korsch, Bordiga, Trotsky, Shachtman, or C.L.R. James, to name only a few, have devoted major energies to settling the famous Russian question, the specific meaning for Marxists of the defeat of the Russian Revolution, and the international successes of Stalinism. The variety of views developed in this debate seems to confirm above all the characterization of Winston Churchill, very far from Marxism and the left, for whom the Soviet Union was a, quote, riddle wrapped in a mystery within an enigma, end quote. The contemporary errors of the theories of, quote, the degenerated workers' state, end quote, state socialism, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, quote, state capitalism, or the, quote, transitional society, all have their analyses and explanations, many of them self-consoling, of the current the current devolution of the Eastern Bloc, with the temperate optimism characteristic of the Marxian tradition. Most of these currents tend to assume, as did this author, that the moribund Stalinist bureaucracy's immediate major contender for power would be the revolutionary working class, fighting at last for real socialism. Few foresaw, most particularly, but not only, the Trotskyists, for whom the Eastern Bloc ostensibly rested on foundations socially superior to the West, but the main contenders for the post-Stalinist succession would not be revolutionary Marxism, but a blindly pro-Western neoliberalism inspired by von Hayek and Milton Friedman, and resurgent authoritarian rightist currents of interwar vintage, with ex-Stalinists prominent in both currents, Even fewer foresaw what the demise of the social foundations of Stalinism would entail. Even fewer foresaw that the demise of the social foundations of Stalinism would entail a profound crisis of Marxism itself. As the crisis of the Eastern Bloc calls forth not Soviets and workers' councils, but blood and soil populism, murderous nationalism, regionalism, religious fundamentalism, and anti-Semitism, authoritarian currents that are far ahead of any remaining left opposition in channeling anti-IMF, anti-market sentiments, it becomes clear that even before the most conceptual frameworks available to revolutionary Marxists, East and West, for understanding world history since 1917 are profoundly in need of re-examination. The following article is written as a modest contribution to that re-examination. It presents for consideration the little-known views of the Italian Marxist Amadeo Bordiga, best remembered, when remembered at all, as one of the, quote, ultra-lefts denounced by Lenin in left-wing communism and infantile disorder, on the nature of the Soviet Union, and more generally considers the thesis that the agrarian question, fundamental for Bordiga in the characterization of capitalism, is the actual little discussed key to the history of both social democracy and Stalinism, the two deformations of Marxism that have dominated the 20th century. It puts forward the thesis that European, and above all German, social democracy itself, even when it spoke on ostensibly Marxist language, was a statist distortion of the Marxian project and more a school for a higher stage of capitalism, the emergent Keynesian welfare state. It argues that what is disappearing today is the long statist detour in working class emancipation, which was actually much more about a substitute bourgeois revolution for the industrialization of backward societies than about socialism or communism. It contends, finally, that any maintenance of the traditional rose-tinted view of historical German social democracy prior to the triumph of, quote, revisionism must lead to a complete impasse and absence of vision for the contemporary period. History, even in advance of theory, is clearing away the debris of the statist legacy of social democracy and Stalinism. Today, the question of how the Marxian project became entwined from the 1860s onward with the statist project of enlightened absolutism and its version of Aufklärung, I think that's enlightenment, I think that's what it means, I'm not sure, is more pressing than ever. Even more pressing, of course, is the question of how it can extricate itself. So I want to make sure I didn't lie there. Yeah, Aufklärung. This one, like, attempts to focus on the centrality of the agrarian question, the Soviet experience, are in themselves hardly new. Figures like Barrington Moore within academia developed such a focus long ago. Sorry, I gotta find the end note here. Footnote, Barrington Moore, Social Origins of Democracy and Dictatorship. Social Origins of Democracy and Dictatorship. It's actually the other way around. Loren Goldner put it wrong. It's actually the Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. And the description of social origins of dictatorship and democracy, Lord and Peasant in the Making of the Modern World, says, this classic work of comparative history explores why some countries have developed as democracies and others as fascist or communist dictatorships. Originally published in 1966, this classic text is a comparative survey of some of what Barrington Moore considers the major and most indicative world economies as they evolved out of pre-modern political systems into industrialism. But Moore is not ultimately concerned with explaining economic development so much as exploring why modes of development produce different political forms that manage the transition to industrialism and modernization. Why did one society modernize into a, quote, relatively free, democratic society, by which Moore means England? Why did others metamorphose into fascist or communist states? His core thesis is that in each country, the relationship between the landlord class and the peasants was a primary influence on the ultimate form of government the society arrived at upon arrival in its modern age. Okay, so back to the text and footnote. But the mood of the 1960s when Moore's book appeared was still very much focused on industrial development as the essence of capitalism, and because Moore otherwise seemed to echo a more pallid version of Trotsky's theories of permanent revolution and combined and uneven development, his work made no particular impact on the Marxist discussion. Adam Ulam, even farther from Marxism, had written in the Cold War period about the real content of the Marxist movement being the agrarian question. His objective was to discredit, quote, Marxism, which Adam Ulam equated with Soviet ideology, end parenthesis, by showing that it was the product of underdevelopment, not of capitalism. Gerschenkron, historically much richer than Ulam, also seemed to be a shadow of Trotsky. So, first off, I want to look up who Adam Ulam is. Wikipedia says Adam Ulam lived from 1922 to 2000 and was a Polish-American historian of Jewish descent and political scientist at Harvard University. Adam Ulam was one of the world's foremost authorities and top experts in Sovietology and Kremlinology. He authored multiple books and articles in these academic disciplines. And the book is Unfinished. The Adam Ulam book that's cited in the text is Unfinished Revolution. Okay, so here we are. The description of the Unfinished Revolution by Adam B. Ulam says, Marxism has been the most pervasive and widespread ideological phenomenon of our times, but seldom, if ever, has Marxism been found in its form. Whenever the Marxist ideology has been historically significant, it has been so as a beneficiary and associate of another set of political beliefs and passions. As a contender for power, Marxist ideology seeks to express the dreams and yearnings of societies caught in the painful process of modernization and industrialization. In power, Marxist ideology tends to pay lip service to its lofty goals, but associates them with old-fashioned nationalism. Practice does not reflect theory. Ruling elites and parties surpass traditional capitalism in their dedication to political centralization and industrialism at all costs. This revised edition of Adam Ulam's standard work retains the author's summary and critique of Marx's historical, economic, and political arguments. Ulam then examines the relationship of Marxism to other schools of contemporary socialism and to other radical and revolutionary theories. Ulam traces the development of Marxian thought, explains why it has been the potent force in certain societies, while in other societies its influence has been insignificant, and analyzes how Marxism and Leninism have affected the shaping of Russian communism. Ultimately, Adam Ulam looks at Marxism in the future, the role Marxism will play in the development of the Soviet Union, and how it will affect the contemporary crisis of liberal institutions in the West. It looks like that book was originally published in 1960. And Alexander Gerschenkron, what book are we looking up here? Economic Backwardness and Historical Perspective. Okay, the description of this book says, these 14 essays, covering a wide range of subjects of great current interest, reflect the continuous evolution of the author's thought from 1951 to 1961. Range and flexibility characterize Alexander Gerschenkron's dynamic approach to Europe's industrial history, connecting evolution in individual countries with their degree of economic backwardness. He presents the industrialization of the continent as a, quote, case of unity in diversity, end quote, thus offering a cogent alternative supported by case studies to the traditional view of industrialization as monotonous repetition of the same process from country to country. Brought together for the first time, these essays were originally published in specialized periodicals in the United States and abroad, explaining and systematizing the elements of creative innovation in industry. Gerschenkron opens new paths of research, poses a number of pertinent questions for the problem of economic development in backward countries. Gerschenkron's versatile analysis not only occupies construction of ingenious industrial output indices and fruitful historical hypotheses on the index number problem, but also original insights gleaned from a study of Soviet novels and a brilliant critique of Dr. Zhivago. Back to the text, end footnote. Undoubtedly, the most important 20th century book influencing Marxist views on the agrarian question within the revolutionary anti-Stalinist milieu is Preobrazhensky's New Economics, which, whatever its flaws, is essential to understanding the fate of the international left opposition. Footnote. Evgeny Preobrazhensky, The New Economics. That's on Libcom. Not seeing any straight up descriptions of the book. End footnote. Preobrazhensky's concept of, quote, socialist accumulation off the peasantry is in turn heavily indebted to Rosa Luxemburg's accumulation of capital. Preobrazhensky posits that the, quote, workers' state can consciously and humanely realize what historically the capitalist state had realized blindly and bloodily, the transformation of the agrarian petty producers into factory workers. It was left to Stalin to realize this transformation consciously and bloodily. End parenthesis. On the margins of this discussion, where most of the Western left is concerned, have been the ideas of the fascinating character of Amadeo Bordiga, first General Secretary of the Italian Communist Party, and with Gramsci its most important founder. Bordiga was the last Western revolutionary who told off Stalin to his face, in 1926, as the gravedigger of the revolution and lived to tell the tale. Bordiga was ousted from the PCI in the same year and took several thousand, quote, Bordigists with him. In 1928, the, quote, Italian communist left, as they called themselves, voted Trotsky the, quote, head of the international left opposition, end quote, and there ensued a lengthy exchange between Bordiga and Trotsky, which ended in generally complete falling out, circa 1931 to 32. But Bordiga is one of the most original, brilliant, and utterly neglected Marxist theorists of the century. Bordiga's legacy could never be made palatable by the post-war PCI in the way that Gramsci's was. Bordiga remained in Italy through the war, once he had been ousted and calumniated by the Comintern in the usual fashion. Bordiga was left alone by Mussolini and pursued a career as an engineer, But it is in some sense after World War II that Bordiga's work, where the present is concerned, becomes truly interesting. Bordiga lived in virtual obscurity until 1970 and even wrote a couple of articles in the upsurge of 1968. His mission after the war was, in his view, to salvage the, quote, theoretical revolutions of the worldwide revolutionary surge of 1917 to 21 period. Bordiga felt, like almost all anti-Stalinist revolutions in 1945, that this required a settling of accounts with the, quote, Russian enigma. And Bordiga wrote 3 books, never translated into English, but they are in French, on the Russian Revolution and the Soviet economy. I have introduction to those books by Jacques Camat, or at least one of those books. I think that part 3 of here's a book called the nature of the socio-economic nature of the USSR, something just like generic. I can't remember what it's called. It's in Italian too, so I'm just kind of guessing at the translation. But I think part 3 of that is specifically about the economy, is more theoretical than history oriented, and I think in the other ones he kind of talks about the history of the Russian Revolution. I'm not sure, but I think that's the case. Bordiga also wrote a 3-volume history of the Italian communist left, a term designating his own faction. The history unfortunately ends in 1921, and many little pamphlets and tracts. Footnote. See bibliographical notes above. End footnote. Much of his stuff is turgid and unreadable, but also well worth the trouble. What is unusual and strangely contemporary about Bordiga's view was quite simply his theory that capitalism equals the Agrarian Revolution. He probably developed this view in the pre-1914 period. Some of his earliest articles are about the French and Italian socialist position on the agrarian question. Footnote. The mature statement on the link between the agrarian question and capitalism is Amadeo Bordiga, Mail la Mers, 1979. End footnote. It is not always easy to follow Bordiga's trajectory. Bordiga believed in, quote, revolutionary anonymity and, quote, abhorred the cult of personality and often did not sign his written work, including his books. A Bordigist assessment of the Russian Revolution was published under the title of On the Margins of the 50th Anniversary of October 1917 in 1967. Footnote. Bilan de une révolution en programme communiste, or programme communiste, I don't know if that's French or whatever. Okay, this is the balance sheet of revolution. Is this written by Bordiga, or is it like by tendency? It says one of the major works of the communist left, Bilan de une révolution, covers the undistorted reality of the great and tragic October Revolution, various false interpretations that still surround it, as well as the development of the Russian economy up until the 1960s, and in much detail its capitalist character. I'll have to read that. Where am I? Sorry, where am I? I'm trying to... Okay. Back to the text, end footnote. It is something outside the, quote, universe of discourse, end quote, of the conventional Stalin-Trotsky, parenthesis, state capitalist, end parenthesis, polemics in the US, Britain, France, and Germany. Parenthesis, for example, Bordiga never uses the term, quote, state capitalism, end quote, and rarely uses the term, quote, Soviet Union, in recognition that the Soviets were destroyed there long ago. For him, it was just Russian capitalism, not notably different from any other. Bordiga had a refreshing desire to want to, quote, de-Russify the preoccupations of the international revolutionary movement. Bordiga said the workers' movement had been rocked by counter-revolutions before in history, parenthesis, i.e. after 1848 with Napoleon, in parenthesis, and that there was nothing special about Russia. On the other hand, his 25-year preoccupation with the Russian economy belies that sang Freud, parenthesis. Of further interest is the fact that in 1945 he had predicted a long period of capitalist expansion and workers' reformism due to end in the next world crisis beginning in 1975, in parenthesis. Footnote. The evolution of Bordiga's prediction of a major world crisis in 75 is presented by F. Livorsi. End footnote. Bordiga's analysis of Russia, as developed after 1945, is as follows. While Bordiga's faction had totally supported Trotsky in the faction fight of the 20s, largely for reasons related to the Soviet Comintern foreign policy, the Bordigist analysis took its distance from the super-industrialization strategy of the left opposition for ultimately, quote, Bukharinist reasons. Bordiga felt after 1945 that only something like Bukharin's strategy had any hope of preserving the international revolutionary character of the regime, which to Bordiga was more important than Russian industrialization, because it would not destroy the Bolshevik Party. Interesting. This is precisely what and he writes, and now it makes sense why Loren Goldner wrote on the back of this book. But this is wrote the praise on the back of his book. But John Eric Merritt has a piece that precisely argues this: that Bukharin's strategy was the only viable strategy to preserve, that could potentially preserve the Smichka and possibly prevent Stalin and maybe some kind of democratic renewal in the Soviet Union from transpiring. Obviously, that's not Bordiga's thing, but it's very interesting. Bukharin said in the 1924 to 28 faction fights that the implementation of Trotsky's left, quote, super-industrialization strategy could only be carried out by the most elephantine state bureaucracy history had ever seen. Footnote: for a distilled discussion of Bukharin's critique of Preobrazhensky, see Bilan d'une Révolution. Against the super-industrializers of the left, Bukharin said that the working class would be, quote, obliged to construct a colossal administrative apparatus, ... The attempt to replace all the petty producers and small peasants by bureaucrats produces an apparatus so colossal that the expense of maintaining it is incomparably greater than the unproductive expenditures resulting from the anarchic conditions of petty production. In sum, the whole economic apparatus of the proletarian state not only does not facilitate, but actually hinders the development of the productive forces. It leads directly to the opposite of what it is supposed to do. End quote. Bukharin. End footnote. When Stalin stole the left's program and put it into practice, Stalin completely confirmed Bukharin, as Trotsky himself acknowledged in a backhanded way after most of his faction in Russia had capitulated to Stalin. Footnote: the, quote, Bukharinist aspect of Trotsky's assessment of the Stalinist, quote, left turn after 1928 is noted in Bilan d'une Révolution. End footnote. Bordiga took more seriously, perhaps, than even Trotsky, the idea of the international character of the revolution and of the Soviet regime. To him, the idea of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, was a grotesque abomination of everything Marxism stood for, which it, of course, was. In his final confrontation with Stalin in Moscow in 1926, Bordiga proposed that all the communist parties of the world should jointly rule the Soviet Union, as a demonstration of the supranational reality of the workers' movement. Footnote: this intervention was made at the 6th Enlarged Executive Committee plenum of the Comintern in 1926. End footnote. This proposal was, needless to say, coolly received by Stalin and his friends. But this is just the beginning. Bordiga's writing on the capitalist nature of the Soviet economy, in contrast to those produced by the Trotskyists, focused to a great extent on the agrarian sector. Bordiga wanted to show how capitalist social relations existed in the kolkhoz and in the sovkhoz, one a cooperative farm and the other the straight wage labor state farm. Footnote. On the capitalist nature of the kolkhoz, see Bilan d'une Revolution. Bordiga emphasized how much, end footnote. Bordiga emphasized how much of agrarian production depended on the small privately owned plots. He was writing in 1950 and predicted quite accurately the rates at which the Soviet Union would start importing wheat after having been such a large exporter from the 1880s to 1914. I know in like one of the pieces by Castoriadis, he frequently talks about like kolkhoz millionaires, which I'm not exactly sure of the meaning of that, and we'll probably learn more about it as this essay goes on, even though it's not about Castoriadis, but kind of like, I guess like the stratification and the within the kolkhoz. Anyway, the reasons leading Bordiga to downplay the industrial sector and to emphasize agriculture, as I said, came from theoretical and strategic concerns that predated the Russian Revolution. Once again, for Bordiga, capitalism was first of all the agrarian revolution, the capitalization of agriculture. Bordiga had a different appraisal of Bukharin from the typical revolutionary opponent of Stalinism because of these concerns. He introduced a novel distinction between Lenin and Trotsky. Most people who distinguish between Lenin and Trotsky are Stalinists and Maoists. But Bordiga totally turns the tables on the Stalinists. Bordiga, using a formulation of Lenin's called the Russian Revolution a, quote, dual revolution, end quote. Footnote. Bordiga's notion of the, quote, dual revolution is scattered through his writings. For one example, see Bordiga, Russie et Révolution. End footnote. In which the political, let me repeat that sentence. But Bordiga totally turns the tables on the Stalinists. Bordiga, using a formulation of Lenin's called the Russian Revolution a, quote, dual revolution, in which the political seizure of power by the proletariat made possible the completion of the tasks of the bourgeois revolution, above all the destruction of pre-capitalist social relations and agriculture. The great prototype of the latter was undoubtedly August 1789 in France. Trotskyists had always said that in April 1917, quote, Lenin became a Trotskyist by accepting the theses of permanent revolution. But Lenin had actually disagreed with Trotsky on nuances, and this showed up in his 1920-22 formulations on the nature of the new regime, above all his remarkable speeches to the 21st Party Congress, in his polemics against the First Workers' Opposition, and their charges that the Soviet state was, quote, state capitalism. In reply, Lenin said that state capitalism would be a tremendous step forward for what Russia actually was, which was a petty producer capitalism with a working-class political party controlling the state. Footnote. See Lenin's Tax in Kind, parenthesis, the significance of the new policy and its conditions, end parenthesis, in Collected Works, Volume 32, presents Lenin's analysis of the relationship between petty producer capitalism and state capitalism in 1921. One second. End footnote. For Bordiga, once this political expression of the working class was destroyed by Stalinism, all that was left was petty producer capitalism. Lenin's use of the term, quote, workers' state, with bureaucratic deformations, end quote, in the early 1920s was quite different from Trotsky's use of the same term in 1936. It is not possible or necessary here to recapitulate the whole evolution of who said what on this question. What lurks behind these differing strategic and tactical judgments are two opposed conceptions of Marxism. What is important is that for Trotsky and the Trotskyists, the permanent character of the revolution was congealed in, quote, property forms, and later was expressed in the growth of the productive forces. Footnote. Trotsky's most lyrical formulations on the growth of the productive forces in the Stalinist, quote, workers' state are in the opening section of The Revolution Betrayed. End footnote. For Bordiga, the growth of the productive forces was merely proof of the bourgeois character of the Soviet phenomenon. Bordiga turned the Stalinists on their head by saying that Trotsky's problem was not his, quote, underestimation of the peasantry, but Trotsky's overestimation of the possibility that the peasants and the agrarian revolution of petty producers could have anything to do with a proletarian revolution. Footnote. This is the formulation of Bilan d'une Révolution. In Bordiga's conception, Stalin and later Mao, Ho, etc. were, quote, great romantic revolutionaries, end quote, in the 19th century sense, i.e. bourgeois revolutionaries. Bordiga felt that the Stalinist regimes that came into existence after 1945 were just extending the bourgeois revolution, i.e. the expropriation of the Prussian Junker class by the Red Army through their agrarian policies and through the development of the productive forces. To the theses of the French ultra-left group Socialisme ou Barbarie, who denounced the regime after 1945 as state capitalist, Bordiga replied with an article, quote, Avanti Barbarie, Onward Barbarians, that hailed the bourgeois revolutionary side of Stalinism as its sole real content. Footnote, cited in Greeley. Parenthesis, one does not have to agree with Bordiga to acknowledge that this was a more coherent viewpoint than the stupidity of the Trotskyist analysis after 1945 that saw the Stalinists in Eastern Europe, China, or Indochina as quavering, quote, reformists eager to sell out to imperialism, end parenthesis. The advanced stage of Bordiga's framework for Trotsky's, the advance of Bordiga's framework over Trotsky's is above all his critique of the assumption smuggled into Trotskyism in the framework of those who work off Trotskyism that Stalin and Stalinism represents a, quote, center between the Bukharinist right and the Trotskyist left. One can hardly imagine how the victory of the Bukharinist, quote, right in the industrialization debate could have done more damage to the international workers' movement than the triumph of Stalin's, quote, the Stalinist, quote, center actually did. Yet anyone who wishes to draw an uncritical line of Marxist continuity through Trotsky after 1924 tacitly accepts his, quote, left-to-right spectrum and its consequences. Trotsky wrote in 1936, quote, socialism has demonstrated its right to victory not on the pages of Das Kapital, but in the language of steel, concrete, and electricity, end quote. That's from the first part of The Revolution Betrayed, which is like a very glowingly, it's like almost, it's embarrassingly praising of Stalinist industrialization. Extending the theory of permanent revolution from the formation of Soviets, parenthesis, 1905-1917, end parenthesis, to state property forms, to the development of the productive forces themselves, parenthesis, i.e. the proof of the deformed socialist character of the regime being its ability to develop industry in the, quote, era of imperialist decay, end quote. Trotsky culminated what I call the, quote, substitute bourgeois revolution, end quote, character of Second and Third International Marxism. Post-war Trotskyists, parenthesis, for whom Trotsky is of course not responsible, end parenthesis, saw the industrialization of the Stalinist regimes during the period when the Third World was showing no signs of development anywhere as the definitive proof of their deformed socialist character. Against this attitude, Bordiga said, quote, one does not build communism. One does not build communism, end quote. The task of the, quote, development of the productive forces, end quote, is not the task of communists. Bordiga also adds, quote, it is exactly right that the, quote, foundations of socialism, end quote, are being built in the Soviet Union, end quote. For Bordiga, this is precisely the proof of the bourgeois character of the regime. One important example of a current which broke from the pro-Stalinist bias of Trotskyism without examining the legacy of the 1920s faction fight was the Shachtmanite tradition and its, quote, bureaucratic collectivist analysis. Their 1940s version, at least, sees a world-conquering dynamism for Stalinism, socialism's revival to succeed capitalism for an epoch, which history has more recently shown to be false. Footnote. See Max Shachtman, The Bureaucratic Revolution, published in 1962, for the most thoroughgoing statement of this view. End footnote. For the Shachtmanite critique, moreover, the whole emphasis is placed on the question of, quote, democracy, which for them is essentially everything. Socialism is effectively conceived as, quote, democratic collectivism, end quote. So its absence and the absence of the surface of capitalist forms must be, quote, bureaucratic collectivism. In other words, this tradition's whole disagreement with Stalinism and then Trotskyism revolved around the fact that what happened in Russia after 1917 or 1921 was anti-democratic. Of course, that was tremendously important, but its influence is to tacitly accept the whole, quote, line of continuity, end quote, through Trotsky and Trotsky's Lenin, and ignore the insight of Bukharin and his prediction about the state. In other words, the whole perspective, parenthesis, the Shachtmanite tradition is deeply oblivious to the Marxian critique of political economy, in parenthesis, revolved around the counterposition bureaucracy/democracy, and therefore, like Trotsky, smuggled in a whole notion of, quote, tasks of the bourgeois revolution that had crept into second and third international Marxism. Except for Bordiga, no one in the anti-Stalinist revolutionary left cited the drive to, quote, develop the productive forces, end quote, themselves as proof that the Soviet Union was not a worker state of some kind. With the Trotskyists, of course, it's the definitive proof, in the framework of nationalizations and planning, that it is. But Bordiga added even more. Engineer that Bordiga was, Bordiga displayed a kind of theoretical rigidity which was both exasperating and effective in allowing Bordiga to see things differently. Bordiga essentially believed that the, quote, communist program had been sent down once and for all by Marx and Engels in 1847 in the Manifesto and confirmed in the following year by the appearance of the communist current in the French and other workers' movements. Bordiga essentially thought that Marx and Engels had worked out a, quote, invariant methodology and that, quote, innovators were always sooner or later clever bourgeois Philistines on the road to Bernsteinism or something like that. But this touching stand on principles set down in 1848 led Bordiga to astounding conclusions about a whole dimension of the Marxist tradition that once again has largely been lost. Bordiga believed that everything important had been said about the Russian question by Marx's death in 1883. Footnote. See Bordiga, Russie et Révolution dans la théorie marxiste, for a discussion of the evolution of Marx's thought on the Russian Commune and Russia's lost, quote, historical chance to skip the capitalist phase, end quote. End footnote. To wit, Marxist correspondence with the populists in the 1870s the 2 cubic meters of notes on Russian agriculture Marx left at his death. Parenthesis, he didn't finish Capital because in the last decade of his life he became fascinated by the agrarian question in Russia, in parenthesis, and the various new prefaces to the Manifesto and other writings from the 1878 to 1883 period that reflected his involvement with Russia. Parenthesis, he had even concealed the extent of this from Engels, who became furious when he realized that work on the Russian question had been the real reason for the incompleteness of Capital, in parenthesis. Footnote. On Marx's deep involvement with the problem of Russian agriculture in the last decade of his life, see Theodore Shannon's essay Late Marx in Theodore Shannon, Late Marx and the Russian Road. Also, Jacques Camat, Bordiga et la Révolution russe. One second. Sorry, one second. The description for Late Marx and the Russian Road, Marx and the Peripheries of Capitalism, edited by Theodore Shannon, says, what did Marx think that communism could be like? The intensive research coupled with public silence during the last decade of Marx's life represented a new theoretical, quote, post-capital threshold. This phase corresponds not accidentally with intensive studies of Russia and contacts with its theorists and revolutionaries. Russia was the first, quote, developing society, and its social and intellectual contexts were to produce by the turn of the century the first wave of, quote, modernization theories and strategies, as well as Leninism. Late Marx and the Russian Road addresses in a new way Marx's attitudes to these, quote, developing or, quote, peripheral societies and to social and social theories that originated in them, and reflect their particularities. The book carries the first full translation into English of Marx's 1881 drafts concerning rural Russia, as well as supplementary material focused on the last decade of his life. It also presents the first translation from Russian of a sequence of writings by Chernyshevsky and the People's Will Party known to have directly influenced Marx. It includes essays by Shannon, Wada, Sayre, and Corrigan, which consider the late period of Marx's analysis and its interdependence with 19th century experience. Back to the text and footnote. The important things for Bordiga were Marx's discovery of the Russian Commune and the belief Marx entertained between 1878 and 1881 that on the basis of the Commune, Russia might literally skip to the capitalist phase of history, might even do so in the absence of revolution in the West, and that the peasants prior to the capitalization of agriculture might be central to the process. Marx wrote in the famous letter to Vera Sasulich that, quote, if Russia follows the path it took after 1861, it will miss the greatest chance to leap over all the fatal alternatives of the capitalist regime that history has ever offered to a people. Like all other countries, it will have to submit to the inexorable laws of that system, end quote. Marx. Footnote. Marx's letter of November 1877 is published in German in Maximilian Rubel's edited volume Marx Engels Die Russische Kommune. Our translation in text. What the hell is I looking up? End footnote. By his death, Marx had decided that Russia had missed the chance and told the Russian populace so. For Bordiga, the preceding quote was the Marxist legacy on the quote Russian question, and quote the whole bloody process of capital accumulation, and quote a prophecy fulfilled by Stalin. This whole side of Marx's relation to Russia largely slipped into dusty archives and footnotes for 80 or 90 years, though it has been revived in recent years by figures such as Jacques Camotte and Theodore Shannon. One can hardly portray Bordiga honestly without mentioning his attitude toward democracy. Bordiga proudly defined himself as, quote, anti-democratic, end quote, and believed himself at one with Marx and Engels on this, parenthesis, its relation to the agrarian question will become clear, end parenthesis. Bordiga's hostility toward democracy had nothing to do with Stalinist gangsterism. Indeed, Bordiga saw fascism and Stalinism as the culmination of bourgeois democracy, exclamation point. The analyses of Italian fascism in 1921-24 by Bordiga's faction, undoubtedly authored in part by Bordiga himself, are available in Communisme et Fascisme, edited by Programme Communiste, 1970. End footnote. Democracy to Bordiga meant above all the manipulation of society as a formless mass. To this, Bordiga counterposed the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, implemented by the Communist Party founded in 1847, based on the principles and program enunciated in the Manifesto. Doesn't Marx say in the Communist Manifesto the goal is to win the battle of democracy? Bordiga often referred to the spirit of Engels' remark that, quote, on the eve of the revolution, the forces of reaction will be amassed against us under the banner of, quote, pure democracy, end quote. As indeed every factional opponent of Bolsheviks from 1921, from the monarchists to the anarchists, called for, quote, Soviets without Bolsheviks, end quote. I'll be cautious about saying that monarchists believed in Soviets without Bolsheviks. Anarchists, yes. Monarchists, no. Bordiga absolutely opposed the idea of revolutionary content being the product of a democratic process of pluralist views, whatever its problems, in light of the history of the past 70 years. This perspective has the merit of underscoring the fact that communism, like all social formations, is above all about programmatic content expressed through forms. It underscores the fact that for Marx, communism is not an ideal to be achieved, but a, quote, real movement, born from the old society with a set of programmatic tasks. Footnote, as Marx said in the Manifesto, communism is not an ideal to be realized, is on the contrary, quote, nothing but the real movement unfolding before our eyes, end quote. For a discussion of communism as the, quote, real movement, see Jean Barrot, Le Mouvement Communiste. That's a Gilles Devey. Eclipse and Reemergence of the Communist Movement. In the New Left atmosphere of the 1960s, in which, quote, economic questions were virtually assumed to have been obviated by the, quote, affluent society, the debate revolved around the almost exclusive counterposition, bureaucracy/democracy, end quote, forms of organization, end quote, leading to a methodological formalism that was of little use when, after 1973, world economic crisis changed all the rules of struggle. In another context, Bordiga, when pressed to identify the capitalist class in Russian capitalism, said that it exists in the interstices of the Russian economy. So let me repeat that, spaced out for a second. In another context, Bordiga, when pressed to identify the capitalist class in his Russian capitalism, said that the capitalist class existed in the interstices of the Russian economy as a class in formation. For Bordiga, the idea of, quote, state capitalism was nonsensical because the state could only be a medium for the interests of a class. For, quote, the state, end quote, to do anything like establish a mode of production was an abandonment of Marxism. For Bordiga, the Soviet Union was a society in transition to capitalism. For Bordiga, the Soviet Union was a society in transition to capitalism. And this kind of shows how much Bordiga is kind of like, at least this is me speaking, in my opinion, like still very much tied to like traditional Marxism in the sense of like dogmatically adhering to the base superstructure metaphor. In fact, the whole premise of, in my opinion, and this is not an opinion that I just have, is that there's a bifurcation in society, in capitalist society in particular, between the economic and the political sphere, and that socialism is a repoliticization of the economic sphere. And whether that politicization takes on some kind of bureaucratic authoritarian form or if it takes on a democratic form, it's a repoliticization of the human reciprocation, human metabolism with nature. The idea, this notion of the state being a passive actor, almost like a sort of epiphenomenon, is kind of taking an aspect of capitalist society that's specific to capitalist society and trans-historicizing it. And it also kind of just like accepts that the economy, in some sense, never mind, I won't go with that. But for Bordiga, the Soviet Union was a society in transition to capitalism. Footnote, this is elaborated by L. Greeley. This critique of formalism, again, had political consequences. It was tied to Bordiga's notion of the role of the Communist Party. Bordiga resolutely opposed the Comintern's turn to the right in 1921. As General Secretary of the PCI, he refused to implement the, quote, United Front strategy of the Third Congress. He refused, in other words, to fuse the newly formed PCI, dominated by, quote, Bordigism, with the left wing of the PSI, from which it had just broken away. Bordiga had a completely different view of the party from the Comintern, which was adapting to the revolutionary ebb announced in 1921 by the Anglo-Russian Trade Agreement, Kronstadt, the implementation of the new economic policy, the banning of factions, and the defeats of the Marx action in Germany. For Bordiga, the Western European Communist Party's strategy of fighting this ebb by absorbing a mass of left-wing social democrats through the, quote, United Front was a complete capitulation to the period of counter-revolutionary ebb he saw setting in. This was the nub of his critique of democracy, for it was in the name of, quote, conquering the masses that the Comintern seemed to be making all kinds of programmatic concessions to left-wing social democrats. For Bordiga, program was everything. A gate receipt notion of numbers was nothing. The role of the party in the period of ebb was to preserve the program and to carry on the agitational and propaganda work possible until the next turn of the tide, not to dilute it while chasing ephemeral popularity. One can argue with this conception, which can lead to the closed world of a sect, as the Bordigist indisputably became. But it has the merit of underscoring another truth to which the Trotskyist wing of the international left opposition and its heirs have been blind. When the, quote, mass parties outside Russia swallowed Stalinism during the 1920s, the foundations had been laid by the 1921 term. It is hardly necessary to accept Bordiga's anti-democratic viewpoint to see this. He completely missed and dismissed the role of Soviets and workers' councils in Russia, Germany, and Italy. but on the, quote, sociological consequences of the 1921, quote, United Front for the future of the Western Communist parties, their, quote, Bolshevization after 1924. Bordiga was right and the Comintern was wrong. Because historically the social base of much post-1924 Stalinism had entered the Western Communist parties through the, quote, United Front tactic of 1921. Because historically the social base of much 1924 Stalinism had entered the Western Communist parties through the United Front tactic of 1921. I'm just wondering, this is just a side note, when the Communist Workers' Party of Germany was established. I think it was established before 1921, which obviously Communist Workers' Party went on, their key intellectuals, their shining lights, went on to become develop council communism. That split from the communist parties. They didn't adopt this parliamentary tactic and didn't kind of like, they missed the United Front tactic, and like obviously they'd already broken from the Communist Party of Germany for political reasons. I'm just thinking, sorry, I had a thought here. It seems like they were not like a minority in the party. They took like a huge chunk of the Communist Party of Germany. And it seems like, actually I have no idea what I'm saying. I guess what I'm saying is that they kind of missed that, missed the Bolshevization period. Anyway, sorry. I was trying to have a thought, but I missed it. A parallel in Russia itself was the, quote, Lenin levy, whereby the party was flooded with malleable, inexperienced, or simply careerist members, easily manipulated by the Stalinists against the remnants of the old guard. The international counterparts of this transformation of the Communist International were figures such as Kachin in the PCF or Talman in the KPD, or Kashin in the PCF, because it's probably how you say his name, and Talman in the KPD. End footnote. Bordiga provided a way of seeing a fundamental degeneration in the world communist movement in 1921, instead of in 1927 with the defeat of Trotsky, end parenthesis, without sinking into mere empty calls for, quote, more democracy. The abstract formal perspective of bureaucracy/democracy, with which the Trotskyist tradition treats this crucial point in Comintern history, became separated from any programmatic content. Bordiga throughout his life called himself a Leninist and never polemicized against Lenin directly, but his totally different appreciation of the 1921 conjuncture, its consequences for the Comintern, and his opposition to Lenin and Trotsky on the United Front issue illustrates a turning point that is generally obscured by the errors of the Trotskyist wing of the international left opposition of the 1920s. Bordiga's idea that capitalism equals the agrarian revolution is the key to the 20th century. It's certainly the key to almost everything the left has called, quote, revolutionary in the 20th century, and it is the key to rethinking the history of Marxism and Marxism's entanglement with ideologies of industrializing backward regions of the world economy. Bordiga obviously does not provide the key to the, quote, de-Russification of the, quote, lenses through which the international revolutionary movement sees the world, but developed further, his focus on the agrarian question does. Into the mid-1970s, the, quote, Russian question and the Russian question's implications was the inescapable, quote, paradigm of political perspective on the left, in Europe and the United States, and yet 15 years later seems like such ancient history. This was a political milieu where the minute study of month-to-month history of the Russian Revolution and the Comintern from 1917 to 1928 seemed the key to the universe as a whole. If someone said they believed that the Russian Revolution had been defeated in 1919, 1921, 1923, 1927, or 1936, or 1953, one had a pretty good sense of what they would think on just about every other political question in the world: the nature of the Soviet Union, of China, of the nature of the world communist parties, the nature of social democracy, the nature of trade unions, the United Front, the Popular Front, national liberation movements, aesthetics and philosophy, the relationship of party and class, the significance of Soviets and workers' councils, whether Luxemburg or Bukharin was right about imperialism. To merely enumerate the major events of world history since 1975 is to see how profoundly the way we see the world has changed. We need only conjure up the 1980s realities of Thatcher's Britain, Reagan's America, Mitterrand's France, Gorbachev's Russia, Deng's China, i.e. the quote neoliberal end quote, parenthesis, in the von Hayek von Mises sense of that term, end parenthesis, tidal wave that has overwhelmed the statism of social democracy, Stalinism, Keynesianism, and Third World Bonapartism. A thorough knowledge of the Russian Revolution from 1917 to 1928 and the quote worldview derived from it seems a poor guide to China's post-76 evolution, Russia under Gorbachev, the appearance of the NICs, the China-Vietnam-Cambodia War, the collapse of the Western European Communist parties, the utter containment of the British Labour Party, the American Democratic Party and the German SPD by the right, the evolution of Mitterrand to neoliberalism, or the appearance of significant, quote, anti-statist currents even in mercantilist regimes like Mexico or India. One might well add to this list a workers' movement in Poland with a heavy dose of clerical nationalism and the revival of fundamentalism in Islam, Judaism and Christianity, deindustrialization, high-tech and gentrification. None of these events discredit Marxism, but they do discredit the virtually universal penchant of the Western left into the 1970s to view reality through lenses inherited from the Russian Revolution and its fate. The best of the heroic phases of German social democracy and Russian Bolshevism was not enough to serve as a guide to this new chapter, this new reality, even though, on the face of things, a consequential, quote, third camper had never had any illusions about the statist political formations and demise from the mid-1970s onward. Yet such a, quote, third camper, accepting Lenin's imperialism and a nexus of other prognoses from the first three Congresses of the Comintern, shared the Stalinist subterranean assumptions about the inability of the capitalist world market to industrialize any part of the Third World, and was essentially thrown into disarray by the emergence of the newly industrializing economies, or new industrializing countries. I want to repeat that. It's a very interesting sentence. I like that. Yet such a, quote, third camper, accepting Lenin's imperialism and a nexus of other prognoses from the first three Congresses of the Comintern, shared with the Stalinist subterranean assumptions about the inability of the capitalist world market to industrialize any part of the Third World, and was equally thrown into disarray by the emergence of the newly industrializing countries. But there is disarray on a deeper level, one that strikes at the hearts of a revolutionary identity derived from the Second and Third Internationals. For if one, quote, maps the militant mass communist parties of regimes existing in Europe between 1920 and 1975, they coincide almost exactly with a map of enlightened despotic states between 1648 and 1789, that is, France, Germany, Russia, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, parenthesis, the most important Scandinavian Communist Party, the only one to survive the World War II as anything more than a sect, end parenthesis. Mass communist parties are absent in Britain, the United States, Holland, Switzerland, parenthesis, and the Anglophone, quote, settler states, end quote, like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, end parenthesis. The apparent exception is the PCI, but Italy spawned the prototypes of enlightened absolutist statecraft, with its important local mercantilist city-states, and regionally the PCI's base of strength seemed to correlate with different regional experiences during the historical phase of the Ancien regime. Finally, the PCI was and is the most, quote, social democratic of the big Western Communist parties after 1956. That is, of course, the reason it is the only one left. The connection between the presence of an enlightened despotic state in 1648 and a mass communist party or Stalinist state in 1945 is the agrarian question. The connection between the presence of an enlightened despotic state in 1648 and a mass communist party or Stalinist state in 1945 is the agrarian question. These states, with France as the prototype, were created to accelerate the capitalization of agriculture. These states, with France as the prototype, were created to accelerate the capitalization of agriculture. I don't know what France has to do with it. To my understanding, France didn't quite capitalize agriculture pretty decently into the 19th century, but I'm not sure. Consciously or not, they were doing to their peasantry something like what the Soviet state was doing to the Russian peasants from 1928 onward, and what liberal capitalist regimes did in the 19th century. The enlightened absolutist states shooting the peasants through taxation. Not shooting the peasants, Jesus Christ. The enlightened absolutist states looting the peasants through taxation as a source of accumulation. These methods were a response to the successful civil societies already brought into existence in the, quote, Calvinist countries, whose success rested on the earlier capitalization of agriculture, above all and first of all in England. Capitalism is first of all the agrarian revolution. Capitalism is first of all the agrarian revolution. Before it is possible to have industry in cities and urban workers, it is necessary to revolutionize the agricultural productivity, to have the surplus to free labor power from the land. Where this had not been accomplished by 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War and hence of the wars of religion, it had to be done by top-down statism. This created the continental mercantile tradition that, after the French Revolution, persisted into the 20th century as a more mature mercantilism. This characterized the Napoleon's Second Empire, which existed between 1852 and 1870, and above all, Bismarck's Prussia and Prussia-dominated Germany. Footnote, there's some things that I missed here. There's some other footnotes that I missed. New industrial countries. See Nigel Harris, The End of the Third World. Nigel Harris wrote a really good book on China called The Mandate of Heaven that I highly recommend. I'd really like to read this book. I'm going to read the description for The End of the Third World by Nigel Harris. The, quote, Third World was invented in the 1950s to identify the third political alternative to that offered by the United States and its European allies on the one hand and the Soviet system on the other, but it was also an economic alternative, a formula whereby the mass of poor countries of the world could use the mechanisms of the state to achieve a firmly based national independence, both political and economic. By the 1980s, however, much of this was under challenge. Some countries had achieved an astonishing pace of development. In others, the development of underdevelopment had reached appalling levels. The third world alternative was becoming no alternative at all. What had gone wrong? What are the lessons of both the developed and developing worlds? The end of the third world. lays out the theories and matches them against what happened in practice. It assesses the development of the Asian, quote, Gang of Four, parenthesis, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, end parenthesis, and the two largest Latin American countries, Mexico and Brazil. I think Brazil actually outpaced, was actually had more growth in it, or not just growth, but like had a bigger economy than England until very recently. I don't know if that's still the case, but it's like really high up there. Does national economic production based on expanded state sector achieve either economic independence or economic development? Do exports reduce independence and produce fewer jobs? Does expansion of manufacturing in the less developed countries produce economic crises, deindustrialization in Europe and North America? Nigel Harris shows how both left and right were seriously mistaken in their view of the state and its role in economic development. Harris describes a newly emerging global economy that is superseding the old national state and the politics based upon it. But the issues raised by the concept of the third world still remain, even if the third world itself is disappearing. Back to the text and footnote. On the capitalization of English agriculture, see Brenner, The Agrarian Origins of European Capitalism, and T.H. Ashton and C.H.E. Philpin in the Brenner debate. Still need to finish that book. End footnote. Footnote. On the mercantile tradition and its impact, see Roman Sporluck, Communism and Nationalism, Karl Marx versus Friedrich List. How do you spell that? Szporluk. It says Roman Sporluck is a Ukrainian-American political scientist and historian. Szporluk is a professor emeritus at Harvard and the University of Michigan. He has written several books and many papers. He's the father of poet Larissa Szporluk and novelist Ben Vendetta. And the book I'm looking for is Communism and Nationalism. Let's read the description, or Communism and Nationalism. In this highly original study, Szporluk examines the relationship between the two dominant ideologies of the 19th century, communism and nationalism, and their enduring legacy in the 20th century. Szporluk argues that both Karl Marx's theory of communism and Friedrich List's theory of nationalism arose in response to the sweeping changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution, and that both sought to promote industrialization as means of reforming the modern world. Each ideology, the author contends, developed in relation to the other and can best be understood as the product of a complex interweaving of the two, producing in the 20th century new forms of nationalism that have incorporated Marxism into the fabric of their movement, and Marxist states that have adopted threads of nationalistic belief. Casting the role of List in the intellectual development of Marx in an unorthodox light, this book adds a new dimension to the debate over the boundaries of nationalism and socialism in the development of political ideologies. That sounds very interesting. End footnote. Prussia-dominated Germany in particular was copied by all the, quote, late developers all over the world after German unification in 1870, starting with Russia. Here, Barrington-Moore's framework, parenthesis, now put into perspective, comes into focus. The decade of the 1860s was a fundamental conjuncture. It saw the U.S. Civil War, the unification of Germany, the unification of Italy, the Russian serf emancipation, and the Meiji Restoration in Japan. One can add, for good measure, the Second Empire industrial development of France and the creation of the Third Republic, but it is secondary. It seems that if a country was not, quote, internally reorganized by 1870, it had no chance of being in the, quote, inner circle of significantly industrialized countries in 1914. Second of the 5 countries mentioned, parenthesis, once again setting France aside, in parenthesis, 4 by 1933 had totalitarian, authoritarian mercantile states. Of the major countries, only those which participated significantly in the first North Atlantic capitalist economy, Britain, France, the U.S., escaped authoritarian mercantile solutions in the 1930s, and only the U.S. of the 5 that reorganized in the 1860s. Parentheses, this is an important clue to the centrality of the pre-industrial historical experience, in parentheses. Why were the 1860s such an apparent cutoff point? The answer seemed to be the 1873 World Depression, and particularly Agrarian Depression. Footnote: for discussion of the post-1873 impact of the Agrarian Depression, see Hans Rosenberg, Great Depression, Große Depression und Bismarckzeit, published in 1967. Wikipedia says Hans Rosenberg was a German refugee historian whose work influenced the whole generation of post-war German scholars. It looks like that book translates into English as the translation of that book into English is The Great Depression of 1873 to 1896 in Central Europe. So let's look that up. Yeah, not seeing any good descriptions of it. End footnote. When the U.S., Canada, Argentina, Australia, and Russia came onto the world grain market as major exporters, it essentially recreated the counterposition of 1648 all over again. The, quote, continental states reacting to the Agrarian Depression of 1873 to 1896 all had to move to protectionism to preserve their national agricultures. The most important case was Germany's, quote, iron and rye alliance of industrialists and Junkers of 1879, which finalized the subjugation of German capitalism and liberalism to the Junker-dominated Prussian/German state. Wikipedia says the marriage of iron and rye is the name given to the coalition of interests between industry and agriculture that supported the adoption of protectionism in Imperial Germany by the Tariff of 1879. In 1818, Prussia adopted low tariffs, including for grain, and these became the basis of the Zollverein Tariff of 1843. In 1853, the duties on grain were abolished, and in 1862, the commercial treaty with France, along with similar treaties with other states, greatly cut the duties for manufactured goods. The Treaty of Frankfurt of 1871 instituted most favored nation status between Germany and France. During the 1850s and 1860s, Germany was a net exporter of grain, and its farmers opposed tariffs for industry, as this might have led to reprisals by Britain against German grain. However, industrialists favored tariffs against British goods to safeguard their infant industries, and therefore came to believe that winning over the farmers to protectionism was crucial. In the late 1870s, world grain prices started to fall due to the opening up of the American prairies to cultivation following the settlement of the Midwest after the Civil War. The increase in railways also helped cheapen grain, which also aided Russian farmers, German grain started to lose ground, and Germany became a net importer of wheat and rye. In 1876, both the Association of Tax and Economic Reformers, consisting mostly of large landowners, and the Central Association of German Industrialists were founded, and in 1878 they combined to pressure the government into protecting both agriculture and industry. The adoption of protectionism by the Chancellor Otto von Bismarck signaled a shift towards a greater reliance on the conservatives for support rather than on the national liberals. The tariff was supported by the two conservative parties in the Center Party and opposed by the progressives and the socialists, with the liberals divided. The tariff protected the great landowners east of the Elbe, the Ostelbier or Junkers, from competition from cheap American grain. Without protection, many of these landowners would have declined. The tariff preserved the economic existence and political ascendancy of the Junker class. Many working men consider the tariff a tax on their food, along with anti-socialist laws that banned the Social Democratic Party. The tariff helped alienate the working class from the state. The historian Erich Eick argued that if Germany's political culture at the beginning of the 20th century differed from Western Europe, agricultural production was largely responsible. Back to the text. The most important case was Germany's iron and rye alliance of industrialists and Junkers of 1879, which finalized the subjugation of German capitalism and liberalism to the Junker-dominated Prussian/German state. But comparable scenarios were acted out in France, Iberia, Italy, and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The emergence onto the world agricultural market of the United States, Canada, Argentina, and Australia drew a line around the existing core of advanced capitalist developments for over a century. By 1890, it was cheaper to ship wheat from Buenos Aires to Barcelona to ship it 100 miles over inland transport. The agricultural sectors of the continental mercantilist states became internationally unviable. The impact of this state of affairs on the development of the workers' movement has not received the attention it deserves. The revolutionary tradition saw socialism/communism as growing essentially out of the explosion of the Third Estate after the French Revolution. In Babeuf, the Enragés, and other radical elements who appeared to the left of the Jacobins, above all in the Revolution of 1848 in France and the rest of Europe, including the Chartists who peaked in England in 1848, History seems persuasive. The line from 1793 to 1794 to 1917 to 1921 passed from France to Germany to Russia in the French revolutions of 1830, 1848, and the Commune, in the rise of the SPD up to 1914, in the Russian 1905 and 1917, climaxing in the failed world revolutionary upsurge of 1917 to 21, with near-revolutionary situations in Germany, Italy, England, Spain, and insurrectionary strikes in almost every other part of the world. This latter is the peak of the, quote, classical workers' movement, end quote. C.L.R. James has talked in terms of the need to reconstitute the historical moment of the breakdown of the German-Russian front in 1917 to 1918, i.e. that in the failure of the German Revolution and the defeat of the World Revolutionary Wave, the World Revolution had its finest hour to date. This trajectory is the framework of Lenin-Trotsky orthodoxy. If the German Revolution had saved Russia from isolation, the 20th century would have undertaken a completely different course. That view of history was a very useful, quote, heuristic device to avoid all the pitfalls of social democracy, Stalinism, Maoism, and Third Worldism. To live within that tradition, whether as a Trotskyist, a third camper, or an ultra-leftist, is to measure history from the vantage point of the German and Russian Soviets of 1917 to 1921. It is not at all a bad benchmark for historical judgment. It is certainly superior to the Keynesian welfare state, the Stalinist successes in the first five-year plan, or labor-intensive agrarian communes in China as a notion of socialist society. But it leads to an impasse. It leads one to viewing history as a strategist for the Comintern in 1920 of taking up where the Central and East European revolutions against the Hohenzollerns, Habsburgs, and Romanovs left off. Yet a historical chasm separates those revolutions and their dual character from the present. Footnote: the Dutch ultra-leftist Herman Gorter confusedly but correctly, already in 1921, grasped the absence of an agrarian question for Western workers as the essence of the difference between the Russian Revolution and any possible revolution in the West, a difference minimized in Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder. See Herman Gorter's open letter to Comrade Lenin. And footnote. The dual nature of the October Revolution was that of a revolution in which historical tasks of the bourgeois revolution were realized under the leadership of the working class, after which the proletarian political content was completely snuffed out by Stalinist counter-revolution. To draw the line of, quote, continuity uncritically through Lenin and Trotsky as the exact extensions of Marx in the early 20th century to make the Russian Revolution the touchstone of the 20th, quote, the turning point of history where history failed to turn, end quote, as someone put it, end parenthesis, is to, quote, buy into a whole view of history before and since 1917. It is above all to accept a mythology about German social democracy as a revolutionary Marxist formation prior to some date, whether 1890 or 1898 or 1914, when the SPD was taken over by, quote, revisionism. If there is one single myth at the bottom of the outlook informed by the, quote, best of German social democracy and Russian Bolshevism, end quote, which has now become problematic, it is the rose-tinted view of the early SPD. It is through that view that the international left was colonized by the lenses of the Aufklärung, which originated in the civil service of the enlightened despotic states. One second. I don't think I was spelling this right earlier when I looked it up, so I gotta look at Aufklärung. Klauerung? I don't know. I guess that's enlightenment, I guess is This actually is what it translates here. Alf Aufklärung, which originated in the civil, is through that view that the international left was colonized by the lenses of Aufklärung, which originated in the civil service of the enlightened despotic states. One can see this impasse on several levels. Let us begin with the, quote, vulgar, non-Marxist materialism that was the bread and butter of the classical workers' movement, originally centered in the SPD, later in the Bolshevik Party of the Second, Third, and Fourth Internationals. As many people ask themselves after discovering the 1844 manuscripts, the Grundrisse, the Hegelian, quote, fingerprints in Capital, the, quote, theses on Feuerbach, Lukács, Kors, etc., how could the classical workers' movement have been taken over by, quote, vulgar Marxism? Why does pre-Kantian materialism, i.e. materialism that, unlike Marx's, has not passed through the dialogue with German idealism and Feuerbach, seem so similar to the 18th century materialism of the Anglo-French Enlightenment, i.e. the ideology of the bourgeois revolution? How does one arrive at a Marxist explanation of the historical hegemony of vulgar materialism, since Marxism rejects out of hand the psychological/moralistic judgment that they, quote, had the wrong ideas, end quote? The answer did not seem so complicated. If the materialism of the classical workers' movement centered in the SPD from 1860 to 1914 and extended by the Russian Revolution was epistemologically little different from the revolutionary materialism of a bourgeois character, it must be that the classical workers' movement in Central and Eastern Europe was an extension of the bourgeois revolution. I'm going to repeat that last sentence. The answer did not seem so complicated if the materialism of the classical workers' movement centered in the SPD from 1860 to 1914 and extended by the Russian Revolution was epistemologically little different from revolutionary materialism of a bourgeois character. It must be that the classical workers' movement in Central and Eastern Europe was an extension of the bourgeois revolution. Placing oneself in the position of the admirers of the heroic early SPD, it is hard to think of any other explanation that makes sense. This is, after all, not so very far from Trotsky's theory of combined and uneven development, where the bourgeoisie is weak and unable to take on the ancien regime. The task falls to the working class. Trotsky's error was to believe that the working class was making the socialist revolution, This, quote, vulgar Marxism provided the, quote, worldview expressed in the popular pamphlets of the late Engels and the writings of Bebel, Kautsky, Wilhelm Liebknecht, the pre-revisionist Bernstein, and Plekhanov, the great eminences of the Second International, who educated Lenin and the Bolsheviks. It should never be forgotten that Lenin did not begin to see through Kautsky and the SPD, quote, center of orthodoxy until 1910 to 1912, and in 1914 could not believe the newspaper reports that the SPD had voted for war credits. Lenin was that close to these influences. Lenin wrote Imperialism to explain the collapse of the SPD. Trotsky later added, quote, the absence of revolutionary leadership, end quote, to explain the defeat in Western Europe after the war. Raya Dunayevskaya's portrait of Lenin rushing to the Zurich Library in September 1914 to read Hegel's Logic to understand the debacle of the SPD may or may not be apocryphal. Nevertheless, the, quote, late Lenin had no impact on official Marxism until after 1917, including in the Fourth International. apocryphal means usually usually is in reference to a story or statement of doubtful authenticity, although widely circulated as being true. And the example says, there is an apocryphal story about a disgraced rock star who ended up in bankruptcy court, end quote. Anyway, footnote. See Raya Dunayevskaya, Philosophy and Revolution. The description of Philosophy and Revolution says, few thought systems have been as distorted and sometimes misconstrued as those of Marx and Hegel. Philosophy and Revolution presents here in a new edition attempts to save Marx from interpretations which restrict the revolutionary significance of the philosophy behind his theory. Developing her breakthrough on Hegel's absolute idea, Raya Dunayevskaya, who died in the June of 1987, aims at total liberation of the human person, not only from the ills of capitalist society, but also from the equally oppressive state capitalism of established communist governments. Dunayevskaya assumes within her theory of class struggle issues as diverse as feminism, black liberation, and even the new nationalism of third world countries. Moreover, Dunayevskaya combines within herself an incorruptible objectivity with a passionate political attitude, making this work a vibrant and concrete discussion of the vicissitudes of society, justice, equality, and existence. Back to the text and footnote. The philosophical views of Lukács and Korsch were laughed out of the Comintern in 1923. In the more intellectually astute milieus in the U.S. left of the mid-1960s, prior to the wave of translations from French, German, and Italian after 1968, perhaps the most sophisticated English language text available on the question of the philosophical background of Marxism was Sidney Hook's Towards an Understanding of Karl Marx. The description for this book says, published in 1933 at a time of widespread unemployment and bank failures, Towards the Understanding of Karl Marx by the young Sidney Hook received great critical acclaim and established his reputation as a brilliant expositor of ideas. By, quote, revolutionary interpretation, Hook meant quite literally that Marx's main objective was to stimulate revolutionary opposition to class society. Hook later abandoned the revolutionary views expressed in this volume, but Hook never abandoned his warm positive views of Marx as a thinker and a fighter for freedom. Hook eventually concluded that 20th century history had proved him and Marx wrong about the necessity of revolutionary means to achieve their mutual social goals. But says his son Ernest B. Hook in an introduction, this concession of error, quote, he did not see ... as an admission of intellectual weakness, but the natural position of a reasonable person when, in the light of observation and experience, he concluded that he erred, end quote. This expanded edition makes readily available for scholars an influential work long out of print and provides critical insight into the intellectual development of one of the 20th century's great thinkers. Back to the text. This was not anyone's fault. It merely reflects the fact that the impact of the discovery of the early writings of Marx, of the real extent of his debt to Hegel, of the critique of vulgar materialism in the quote, Theses on Feuerbach, and of works like the Grundrisse really only got beyond small circles of specialists in the 1950s and 1960s. But there had to be a historical reason for that. It wasn't just a question of what was published when and where. The Grundrisse, for example, was first published in only 200 copies in German in Moscow in 1941. But the key to this ideological anachronism in Marxist and working class history clearly cannot be, as we said above, that, quote, they had the wrong ideas, end quote. The answer has to lie at deeper levels of the history of accumulation and how it shaped class struggle internationally. Once again, the Bordiga's tradition unearthed perspectives quite marginal to the general debates of the 1960s and 1970s, perspectives that I think tie together the agrarian question, the periodization of capitalist accumulation, the real historical role of social democracy and Bolshevism, and the historic link between enlightened absolutism in the 17th century and mass-based communist parties in the 20th. The most interesting perspective developed to illustrate these questions was that of the quote neo-Bordigas. French currents influenced by Bordiga, but not slavishly, the best of them attempted to synthesize Bordiga, who was oblivious to the historical significance of Soviets, workers' councils, and workers' democracy, and who placed everything in the party, with the German and Dutch ultra-left who glorified workers' councils and explained everything that had gone wrong after 1917 in terms of, quote, Leninism. All the French currents put at the center stage a text of Marx which in the long run may be more important than all the other new material that started to come to light in the 1950s and 1960s, the so-called unpublished sixth chapter of Capital Volume 1, which is on this channel. It is not known why Marx removed it from the original version of Volume 1, but it is a materialist, quote, phenomenology of mind. 10 pages suffice to refute the Althusserian claims that Marx forgot Hegel in his, quote, late period. But the affirmation of the continuity with Hegel's method is the least of it. The fundamental categories elaborated in the text are the distinctions between absolute and relative surplus value, and what Marx calls the, quote, extensive and, quote, intensive phases of accumulation, corresponding to the, quote, formal and, quote, real domination of capital over labor. These are introduced in a very theoretical way. Marx doesn't attempt to apply them to history generally, but the French ultra-left started to periodize capitalist history around exactly these distinctions. Quote, extensive and, quote, intensive phases of capitalist history are not unique to Marxists. They have also been used by bourgeois economic historians as descriptive devices. One current summarized the distinction in its essence as, quote, the phase which desubstantializes the worker to leave only the proletarian, end quote. Footnote. That's from a pamphlet of the French group Negation, Lip, and the Self-Managed Counter-Revolution. It says that this is that article by Negation, Lip, and the Self-Managed Counter-Revolution is a critical article about workers' struggles at the Lip watch factory in France, where workers began self-managing the firm. End footnote. In that sentence is the condemnation of the whole Gutman school of the New Labor history. It seems to be referring to a Herbert Gutman. who lived from 1928 to 1985 and was an American professor of history at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, where he wrote on slavery and labor history. In that sentence is the, back to the text. In that sentence is the condemnation of the whole Gutman school of the new labor history. The transition to, quote, intensive accumulation in the 6 chapters presented to the, quote, reduction of labor to the most general capitalist form of abstract labor, end quote. The concise definition of the mass production labor process of the 20th century in the advanced capitalist world. The new labor history is one long nostalgia song for the phase of formal domination. The, quote, unpublished 6th chapter also sheds light on the, quote, Hegel Renaissance in Marxism and why serious interest in the Hegelian background of Marx had appeared first in Germany in the 1920s, Lukács Korsch, the Frankfurt School, and had only taken hold in France in the 1950s. In fact, vulgar Marxism had only become a fashionable ideology in France, in the intelligentsia, in the 1930s and 1940s, i.e., during the Popular Front and Resistance. What could explain this 30-year gap between France and Germany? The obvious answer had to be the great superiority of Germany in industrial development in the 1920s, which France began to rival in the 1950s. There seemed to be some connection between, quote, Hegelianized Marxism and the conditions of what we called, quote, intensive accumulation and, quote, real domination. It is also curious that Italy had a sophisticated, much more, quote, Germanized Marxist culture well before France. This must also be related in some way to Italy's status as a political, quote, latecomer, in contrast to France's participation in the first North Atlantic capitalist economy and the bourgeois revolutionary wave of 1770 to 1815. The Jacobin tradition in France, expressed through the rationalism associated with Comte, Saint-Simon, and Gued, and the Kantian idealism of Jaurès, or the rationalism of even the anarchist tradition, with its belief in anti-clerical science, or, finally, the, quote, positivisme, laïque et républicain of the Third Republic remained beneath the level of post-Kantian German thought. Italy was, quote, Germanized in the 1890s, France only in the 1930s and 1940s. The Lenin-Trotsky tradition divides the history of capitalism into 2 phases, separated by World War I, inaugurating the, quote, epoch of imperialist decay, end quote. The theoretical sources of this theory come from the, quote, monopoly capital discussion prior to World War I, Hobson, Hilferding, Lenin. It was popularized by an epoch by Lenin's imperialism. Capitalism in the heyday of the Second International looked different from the system described in Marx. It is important to remember that volumes 2 and 3 only became available in the 1880s and 1890s. Most socialist militants' relation to, quote, Marxist economics has come from volume 1 and more realistically from popular pamphlets like Wages, Prices, and Profits. Capitalism seemed to be moving away from a, quote, competitive or, quote, laissez-faire phase to a phase of cartels, monopolies, imperialism, state guidance, the emergence of finance capital, arms races, colonial land grabs, all the elements Hilferding called, quote, organized capital circa 1910. World War I marked the turning point. The Russian Revolution showed that, in Lenin's phrase, quote, the proletarian revolution lurks behind every strike, end quote. And the 1917 to 1921 period was very nearly seemed to confirm that. Then came, after an ephemeral stabilization, 1929, World Depression, fascism, Stalinism, and World War II, followed in turn by incessant wars of national liberation. Who, in 1950, could deny that this was the, quote, epoch of imperial decay, end quote. These very real phenomenons cemented a whole world view, first codified in the early years of the Comintern, the continuity with the Kautskian vulgar Marxism of the pre-1914 period, the quote monopoly capital characterization of the epoch, most ably expressed by Bukharin, Trotsky's theories of permanent revolution and combined and uneven development, and the Congress characterization of the epoch as that of quote imperialist decay. This, at least, was condensed expression of the heritage as it was recaptured in the best attempts of the late 60s and early 70s to relink with the revolutionary potential of the German-Polish-Russian corridor of 1905 and 1917 to 1921. This period of modern history allowed one to see the world, quote, from Moscow in 1920, end quote, and this again made the unraveling of the history of the Russian Revolution and of the Comintern from 1917 to 1928 so central and so apparently full of implications. In that history was the philosopher's stone, whether Trotskyist, Shachtmanite, or ultra-leftist. This was the viewpoint of those who, in the mid-1970s, had no illusions about social democracy, Stalinism, or Third World Bonapartism, i.e., who opposed them from the vantage point of revolutionary workers' democracy of the Soviet Worker Council variety. On one level, this seemed a perfect coherent explanation of the world into the mid-1970s, had not the highest expression of the revolutionary workers' movement taken place in Germany and Russia, had not everything since been disaster and bureaucratic nightmare. Bordiga anticipated this attitude when Bordiga wrote, sometime in the 1950s, that, quote, just because social evolution is in one zone, by which he meant Europe and the U.S., has come to the last phase, does not mean that what happens on the rest of the planet is socially of no interest, end quote. For this world view, shared in that period by the author, what was happening on the rest of the planet was precisely socially of no interest. Who could seriously propose China or North Korea or Albania or the national liberation movements in their states as models for American or European workers? But such a view, while correct, was not adequate. Why not? Because it ignored two realities already well underway in the mid-1970s. The double movement of third world industrialization and technology-intensive, quote, high-tech, end quote, development in the advanced sector that were about to crash down around the Western working class movement, upon which the whole earlier perspective rested. In 1970, in the midst of Stalinist, Maoist, and Third World euphoria over peasant bureaucratic revolutions, it was right and revolutionary to look to the Western working class as the only class that could actually end class society. It was necessary to reject that Third World as hogwash then, as it is necessary to reject its quite enfeebled remnants today. But what has changed since then is, of course, that deindustrialization in the West and industrialization in the Third World, two sides of the same coin, have created real workers' movements in the Third World itself. South Korea being the most recent instance. Into the mid-70s, the world looked pretty much like what could be extrapolated from the early heroic Comintern view sketched above. The countries that were the core of world industry in 1914, Western Europe, the US, and Japan, were still the core. In terms of the earlier discussion, if a country had not been, quote, internally reorganized by the 1860s, it wasn't going to be in the, quote, industrial club in 1914 and still wouldn't be circa 1975. Further, the percentage of workers in manufacture in the advanced industrial countries, which had peaked at circa 45% in Germany and England circa 1900 to 1914, was still close to that figure for the advanced capitalist zone as a whole in the early 70s. What had changed in the interim? Clearly, the advanced capitalist world had gone from a very rough breakdown of its workforce in 1900 to 1914 of 45% in industry, 45% in agriculture, 10% in white-collar services, 40 to 45% in industry, 5 to 10% in agriculture, and 40 to 45% in white-collar services, not to mention the creation of a large arms sector that had only barely come into existence around the turn of the century. What did this indicate? It indicated that the, quote, story of capitalist development was as follows. In 1815 to 1914, the phase of, quote, classic or, quote, competitive capitalism, the system had primarily transformed peasants into workers, at least in England, the US, France, and Germany. In the post-1914 period, in reality beginning circa 1890, the new phase of, quote, organized capitalism, quote, monopoly capitalism, the, quote, epoch of imperialist decay, continued to deplete the rural population of the Western world. Deplete the rural populations of the Western world and Latin America, the Caribbean, South Europe, and Africa. But to accomplish what? Instead of continuing to expand the industrial workforce, it used the greatly increased productivity of a stagnant percentage of the workforce to support an ever-growing white-collar, quote, service sector and arms production. But to return to the basic theme, hardcore communist parties start to erode and be superseded by integrated social democratic type parties precisely when the agrarian population of the country in question is reduced to a trivial 5 to 10% of the workforce. This is what happened, for example, in France and Spain in the last 15 years. This is what has not happened in Portugal, precisely because small producer Portuguese agriculture remains a very significant percentage of the workforce. This is the backdrop to the transformation of the PCI. It is, Communist Party of Italy. It is what happened long ago in Northern Europe and the United States. It is finally the strict parallel to the problems encountered in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union when the, quote, extensive phase of accumulation is completed, and it is time to move to the intensive phase, which the West arrived at through the crisis of 1914 to 1945. In short, from enlightened absolutism in the 17th century to communist parties in the 20th century, the problematic is that of the extensive phase of accumulation, the transformation of peasants into workers. The ultimate implication of this is that a society is only fully capitalist when a trivial percentage of the workforce is employed in agriculture, i.e. that a society is only fully capitalist when it is moved from the extensive/formal to the intensive/real phase of accumulation. This means, in short, that neither Europe nor the United States in 1900 were as capitalist as the social movements thought they were, and that the classical workers' movement in its mainstream was first and foremost a movement to propel capitalism into its intensive phase. I'm going to repeat that sentence. Hold on. This means, in short, that neither Europe nor the United States in 1900 were as capitalist as the socialist movement thought they were, and that the classical workers' movement in its mainstream was first and foremost a movement to propel capitalism into its intensive phase. In sum, capitalism means, first of all, the agrarian revolution. The agrarian question has had multiple meanings in the history of the international left. It has arisen in connection with the peasant revolutions that accompanied the French and Russian revolutions, the capitalization of agriculture in the U.S. South through the Civil War, the agrarian depression after 1873, the emptying of the European countryside after World War II. Undoubtedly, these are seriously distinct phenomena that should not be lumped together cavalierly. But let us focus on intensive accumulation linked to the reduction of the agrarian workforce to 5 to 10% of the population as the definition of a, quote, fully capitalist society. A fully capitalist agriculture is an American-style mechanized agriculture. The, quote, agrarian question, in this sense, was not solved in France in 1789, but in 1845 to 1973. The connection between agriculture and intensive accumulation in industry is the reduction of the cost of food as a percentage of the worker's bill of consumption, creating buying power for the consumer durables, such as the automobile, at the center of 20th century mass production. Let us summarize and then return one more time to Bordiga and the Neo-Bordigists. Vulgar Marxism was an ideology of the Central and Eastern European intelligentsia linked to the workers' movement in a battle to complete the bourgeois revolution. Parentheses, Second and Third International Marxism, end parentheses. I would say that's true of Marxism in general, not just vulgar Marxism. Its parallel to pre-Kantian, pre-1789 bourgeois materialism is not the result of a, quote, error, quote, they had the wrong ideas, end quote, but a precise expression of the real content of the movement that developed it. That content makes sense ultimately in the framework of a periodization of capitalist history that complements the Lenin/Trotsky, quote, epoch of imperialist decay, end quote, with the concepts of extensive formal domination and intensive/real accumulation. The whole Lenin/Hilferding Second International theory of, quote, organized capitalism and, quote, monopoly capitalism is then an occultation of the transition from extensive to intensive. The, quote, official Marxist outlook, therefore, is the outlook of an ascent state elite, in or out of power, whose movement results in another form of capitalism, parenthesis, real domination, end parenthesis, and calls it, quote, socialism. What is compelling about such an analysis is that it avoids moralizing and offers a, quote, sociological explanation for a, quote, epistemology. Once again, it means that this social stratum that held an Aufklärung form of materialism because it was a proto-state civil service in a development regime, and that its economics, codified in the Leninist theory of imperialism, were also the economics of that stratum. It is not real Marxism because it tends to replace analyses of relations and forces of production with, parenthesis, ultimately Düringian, and parenthesis, analyses of force. That's a reference to this, like Eugen Düring of anti-Düring fame. From Lenin and Bukharin via Baran and Sweezy to Bedeline and Amin to Pol Pot, parenthesis, recognizing tremendous discontinuity and degeneration, but also continuity, end parenthesis. The, quote, monopoly capital theory is the theory of state bureaucrats. It is fundamentally anti-working class. It sees the Western working class's reformism as the expression of, quote, super profits from imperialism, and it obscures the difference of interest between the state bureaucratic elite and the peasant and working classes in the underdeveloped countries where it holds power. The French neo-Bordigists, specifically Kamat, showed that it was in Russia above all that Marxism, in phases, was transformed from a theory of the, quote, material human community, end quote, a real movement that is, quote, born from mature capitalism into something that is, quote, built in backward proto-capitalism. This is seen by the contrast between the, quote, Marxist position on the Russian question developed by Marx in 1878 to 1883 and the Bolshevik polemic with the last phase of populism in the 1890s. Whatever Marx may have entertained in his study of the Russian Commune as the possible base for an immediate, quote, leap to communism, Marx never would have written, as Trotsky wrote in 1936, that, quote, socialism now confronts capitalism in tons of steel and concrete, end quote. This is not to say that there is no basis for this productivist discourse in Marx's work. It is simply to say that the gulf that separates Marx from all second, third, and fourth international Marxism is precisely that he is beyond, quote, pre-Kantian materialism and way beyond, quote, monopoly capital economics, and that expresses a state civil service view of the world. In the battle between Lenin and the populists in the 1890s, the battle to introduce this truncated Second International, quote, Marxism into Russia, the whole pre-1883 dimension of the Marxist analysis of the, quote, Russian question, unearthed by Bordiga, was totally lost in a productivist chorus. The linear mechanistic affirmation of, quote, progress, that is the core of Enlightenment historical thought, which was taken over into a quote, stage theory of history by vulgar Marxism, has no feel for the Russian agrarian commune as Marx did. The Gemeinwesen, material human community, telos of communism, is suppressed for productivism. Once in power, the Bolsheviks took the reproduction schema and categories of Volume 1 of Capital and translated them into their manuals for economic planning without noticing that this was a, quote, Ricardian description of capitalism, which Marx undermines in Volume 3. This paved the way for the, quote, steel eater ideology of the Stalinist planners after 1928. I like that, steel eater. There is already a world between Marx and the Second International, and later the Bolsheviks, expressed in, quote, philosophy and in, quote, economics, and these differences express different, quote, social epistemologies, rooted in the outlooks of two different classes, the working class and the state civil service. It is in this sense that it is meaningful to say that the best of German social democracy and Russian Bolshevism are hopelessly entwined with the state. A renewal of revolutionary vision can no longer identify them as direct heirs, but as a detour whereby Marxism fused with a statist discourse foreign to Marxism's self. We in the West today, unlike the revolutionaries of 1910, live in a totally capitalist world. There is no capitalization of agriculture to accomplish, no, quote, peasant question for the workers' movement. At the same time, in the midst of a deepening world economic crisis, one second. Sorry, where am I? Where am I? Shit. There is no capitalization of agriculture to accomplish, no, quote, peasant question for the workers' movement. At the same time, in the midst of a deepening world economic crisis of 1930s proportions, all the old revolutionary visions have evaporated, and the sense of what a positive world beyond capitalism would look like is less clear than ever. Recent history provides many examples of negative alternatives, Yet when we understand that much of what is collapsing today is ultimately the legacy of the enlightened absolutist state and its modern extensions, we can see that many of the conceptual tools in use until quite recently were tools for the completion of the bourgeois revolution, developed by movements ultimately headed by state civil servants, real or potential. By freeing Marxism of this statist legacy, we can at last start to understand the world from the vantage point of the, quote, real movement unfolding before our eyes, end quote. Communist Manifesto. Okay, so that's the end of the piece in general. There's a footnote that I met. It said, Rita de Leo I operai e il sistema sovietico. I think she was like an Italian operismo person. I think she has a section in, or like at least comments on her in Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. But I don't think particularly. I mean, there's particularly too much commentary on Soviet history within Aparismo. It says, Rita de Leo I operai e il Sistema Sovietico, published in 1971, Chapter 1, provides a good discussion of the Soviet use of Volume 1 of Marx's Capital as a, quote, manual from which the categories of the planning process were developed. I missed that footnote. But now that the piece is over, there's a bibliography. One object of this article was to make the person and ideas of Bordiga better known in the English-speaking world. Unfortunately, many of the sources upon which the article draws were published only in Italian or French by obscure left-wing publishers, many of which no longer exist. They are thus, aside from the writings of Bordiga himself, virtually impossible to obtain. Readers who wish to acquire the available writings of Bordiga in various languages can contact the Partito Comunista Internazionale via Mazzini 30, Schio, Italy. The important writings of Bordiga are as follows: The Struttura Economica e Sociale della Russia de oggi. In his major work on the Russian economy, a large part of it was published in French under the title Russie et Révolution dans la théorie marxiste in 1975. This was followed by a complete translation, Structure économique et sociale de la Russie d'aujourd'hui. I have no idea. The Storia della Sinistra Comunista, the history of Bordiga's faction from 1912 to 1921, appears in 3 successive volumes beginning in 1964. Shorter but fundamental theoretical statements are Proprietà e Capitale and Mai la merce sfamarla l'uomo, la questione agraria e la teoria della rendita fondiaria, secondo. A French collection of some of Bordiga's shorter texts, including his commentaries on Marx's 1844 manuscripts, were edited with a preface by Jacques Camat in Bordiga et la passion du communisme. There is, to my knowledge, no adequate comprehensive study of Bordiga. 2 works which avoid the worst errors and earlier calumnies are A. de Clementi, Amadeo Bordiga, published in 1971, and a biography by a PCI intellectual, Franco Livorsi, Amadeo Bordiga, published in 1976. A presentation of Bordiga's views on the Soviet phenomenon is Liliana Grilli, Amadeo Bordiga, Capitalismo Sovietico e Comunismo. The best, published in 1982. I'd love to read that book. The best overall presentation of Bordiga and his theories as they influenced the present article are in Camat. This article, Bordiga et la Révolution russe. Bordiga et les révolutions russes, Russie et nécessite du communisme, in the journal Invariants. A critical appreciation of the Bordiga's faction is La Gauche Communiste d'Italie, published in 1981 by the Courant Communiste International. An overall, quote, Bordigist view of the Russian Revolution and its aftermath is a special tribute issue of Programme Communiste, Bilan d'une Révolution, published in 1968, the theoretical journal of one of the then contending Bordigist parties. I have not been able to ascertain if the views expressed in this issue were written or approved by Bordiga himself. 2 further works of interest which draw critically on Bordiga are Jean Barrot, Le Mouvement Communiste, which is Gilles Devey, and Jacques Camat, Kapital et Gemeinwesen, the 6th chapter inédit et l'œuvre économique de Marx. Much information on Bordiga in this period of his greatest mass influence is in the quasi-official history of the Italian Communist Party by Paolo Spriano, Storia del Partito Comunista Italiano de Bordiga a Gramsci. This work, like that of Livorsi, is to be used with caution. All right, that's the end of the piece. Thank you for listening.